Story 1. It was a cool autumn night when I received the call from dispatch telling me I'd be heading down to town of Willow Creek, Texas to pick up a shipment. I usually didn't mind the long hauls across the country, but this one had me feeling a bit uneasy. The pickup location was in up small town of Oak Ridge, right on the border between Texas and Mexico. I'd be getting the shipment from a warehouse behind one of those massive 24-hour retail stores that seem to have everything under the sun. After driving for what felt like an eternity, I finally pulled my rig into the mostly empty parking lot around 11 p.m. The wariness was really starting to kick in after the long trek down from Idaho, so I decided I'd try to catch a few hours of shut-eye in the back of the vacant lot before the early morning pickup time. But first, I headed into the brightly lit store to grab a quick bite to eat. The aisles were nearly empty except for the few overnight stock crew members methodically working to restock the shelves. I grabbed a prepackaged sandwich and a soda from the cooler and swiftly made my way back out to my truck. As I walked across the dimly lit parking lot, absent-mindedly munching on my meager dinner, I noticed two sketchy-looking guys loitering near the back of my rig. They seemed to be fidgeting with something near the cargo doors. I called out to them, asking if I could help them find what they were looking for. They turned and shot me a strange look, then wordlessly slunk off into the darkness between the rows of cars. Something about the encounter gave me an uneasy feeling, but I tried to shrug it off as I climbed into the cab. After scarfing down my less than satisfying meal, I reclined the driver's seat as far back as it would go in an attempt to get somewhat comfortable. I lazily flipped through the static-filled channels on the tiny TV mounted on the dashboard, but couldn't seem to find anything worth watching. The harsh yellow lights from the parking lot lamps filtered in through the curtains, covering the small windows lining the cab. Through the gaps, I could still faintly make out the shapes of the few vehicles left in the lot, along with the occasional customer hustling in or out of the store. Eventually, the chatter of shoppers faded away, and the parking lot grew quiet and still as the night wore on. My heavy eyelids began to droop closed despite my best efforts to stay alert. After a few more minutes of fighting against my increasing drowsiness, I finally drifted off to sleep. A sudden loud bang outside the truck jolted me awake. I sat bolt upright, momentarily confused about where I was. Another loud metallic thump sounded from somewhere in the back of my trailer. My pulse began to quicken as my groggy mind cleared. Someone was definitely out there messing with my rig. I started to climb between the seats to check out the back when the passenger side window unexpectedly exploded right next to my head. Instinctively, I threw my hands up to shield my face from the spray of glass shards raining down into the cab. Before I could even react, the door was violently flung open and a dark figure found himself inside. Something glinted menacingly in his hand as he drew it back, a crowbar. He ruthlessly swung the heavy metal bar, brutally striking my forearms as I tried in vain to block the blows. The force of the impacts knocked me sideways, and I tumbled out of the driver's seat onto the floorboards. Suddenly, I felt rough hands grab me from behind and viciously yank me out of the cab onto the hard pavement below. I landed flat on my back, instantly knocking the wind right out of me. Gasping desperately for air, I attempted to roll over and push myself up. But before I could even catch my breath, there they were, the same two thugs I'd spotted at the back of my truck earlier. The one with the crowbar pulled it over his shoulder, poised to strike. As I looked up helplessly, he swung with savage force, the blow landing squarely across my ribs. I yelped in agony as searing pain radiated through my chest. I tried to curl into a protective ball, but the two men began raining kicks and blows relentlessly down upon my weakened body. I struggled with all my might to get to my feet and fight back, but I could hardly draw a breath between the endless barrage of stomps and strikes from the unforgiving metal bar. Finally, there was a brief pause in the brutal beating, most likely as my attackers grew tired. Mustering every ounce of strength I had left, I attempted to drag myself across the oil-stained asphalt, desperately grasping for my keys that must have fallen from my pocket during the struggle. But in an instant, the men were on me again, ruthlessly stomping and swinging the crowbar without mercy. Darkness crept into my vision as the taste of blood filled my mouth. Just before losing consciousness, I felt one final excruciating crack against the base of my skull. I gradually came to, a throbbing agony encompassing my entire body. I was laying on a cold metal floor vibrating beneath me. As my faculties slowly returned, I realized I was in the back of my own trailer, which could only mean one thing: they had gotten my keys. I attempted to push myself up to seated, but a sharp stabbing sensation in my chest forced me to collapse back down with a pained groan. Drawing breath was becoming more and more difficult, and I could feel my waning strength seeping away. The rumbling truck rolled to a stop, sending a fresh wave of torment through my battered frame. I knew I had to get it together and be ready for whatever nightmare awaited me next. Mustering my last reserves of energy, I painfully pulled myself up the ribbed metal wall of the trailer to my hands and knees. Crawling pathetically like a newborn, I shakily made my way toward the back doors, desperate for any chance to escape this hell. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally detected the cab doors opening and closing again, accompanied by approaching footsteps outside. My heart pounded fiercely beneath my bruised ribs in anticipation of the horrors to come. The outside latch mechanism clicked loudly as the rear doors were drawn open. I recoiled and shielded my swelling eyes as blinding sunlight flooded the back of the trailer. "Don't move, hands up," an authoritative voice bellowed from outside. Squinting toward the source, I could barely make out two uniformed police officers training their guns on me. Relief washed over me when I realized they pulled over the truck. With great effort, I complied with their orders, weakly raising my trembling hands. The officers quickly holstered their weapons when they got sight of my dire condition. One radioed for an ambulance, while the other climbed inside to help me out of that nightmarish prison. Later at the hospital, a detective came to take my statement and fill me in on all that had transpired after I lost consciousness. Apparently, the two men who'd ambushed me were members of the notorious Jones cartel, the violent criminal syndicate involved in drug smuggling and human trafficking operations in the border region. Their plan had been to hijack my rig to covertly transport a large shipment of contraband into the country. By some miracle, a highway patrol officer had noticed erratic driving from the truck and initiated the traffic stop that ultimately saved my life. The detective informed me that both perpetrators had extensive records and would be put away for the maximum time allowed by law. As horrific as the whole experience had been, I was beyond grateful to have survived the terrifying ordeal when so many others have not been nearly as fortunate after crossing paths with a merciless cartel. Once healed up, I'll undoubtedly get back to the job. I love driving the open highways. But needless to say, I'll be taking every precaution going forward and keeping rest to well-lit public truck stops. Story 2. I used to think that driving a truck in New York City was the toughest job that I ever had. But the second I started driving for a distribution center further upstate, I realized that those dense city streets were nothing compared to the winding mountain roads, especially when it rains. Now my biggest mistake came when I was dreading old habits from driving the city to the new area that I was working in. It was my third week on the job, and I was heading from the warehouse in Kingston, New York, with a shipment that was going up toward Burlington, Vermont. It was about 1:30 in the morning when I noticed that the rain was starting to come down, and I turned my wipers on. I let out a groan because I knew that this meant I would have to slow down whenever the GPS took me off the highway, which happened pretty frequently, especially toward the end of the drive as I was passing over the mountains. As soon as I got onto the off-ramp, I began slowing the truck down and continued to take it as slow as I could as I began winding my way down the mountainside. My speed started to pick up a bit, but I didn't want to lock the brakes unnecessarily, so I only slightly pressed on the brakes, which probably wasn't the smartest decision I've made. The speed continued to pick up, and finally I decided that I needed to press the brakes a bit harder, but as soon as I did, I felt the truck start to slip out, as if I had just begun to hydroplane. I finally felt my tires gain traction again, and I slammed down on the brakes, but it was too late. A tight curve was coming up, and I tried my best to make it. But as the truck was coming to a stop, the front end of the cab tore right through the guardrail. I closed my eyes as I expected the truck to go flying off the side of the mountain. But somehow it managed to come to a stop before the entire thing went over. I opened my eyes as the truck came to a complete stop, and I looked in the side mirrors and saw that the rear section of the truck was caught on the mangled guardrail. That was the only reason why I wasn't sent plummeting downward, likely to my death. I slowly moved to lean out of the window to see if there was anything underneath me. And as I leaned my head out, I could see that there was about a 20-foot drop between me and the ground below. I slowly sat back down in my seat as I tried to figure out my best course of action. I reached for my phone, and as I moved a bit, I could hear the sound of creaking metal coming from behind me. I moved even slower as I grabbed my phone and called emergency services for help. I told them my location and the precarious situation I was in, and they assured me that help was on the way and not to move. I have to admit, I contemplated trying to climb out of the door and over to the road, but every tiny movement I made seemed to disturb the delicate balance of the teetering truck. So I didn't want to risk causing it to shift and fall further. I sat there for 3 agonizing hours as I waited for the fire department to reach me. With each gust of wind that blew by, I prayed that the battered truck would continue to hold me up. Finally, the fire department decided that their best course of action would be to carefully extend a ladder out toward my truck with a harnessed firefighter on it. Once he reached my door, he asked me to slowly open it, but not let it swing freely. I moved as cautiously as I could as I reached for the handle and cracked the door open. I tried to open it slowly like he said, but as soon as it was ajar, the wind whipped up and tossed it wide open. The truck shook and groaned a bit, and we all held our breath, wondering if this would be the final straw. Thankfully, it didn't shift as much as I feared, and once the door was open, the firefighter helped me into a safety harness and then out onto the extended ladder. I crawled back to the security of the road and took one last glance at my battered truck, wondering what would become of it. The emergency responders informed me that a heavy-duty towing company would be called in to attempt to extricate and move the precariously positioned truck off of the mountainside. In the meantime, though, I was given a ride to the nearest hospital to get checked out and make sure I didn't sustain any injuries in the accident. Aside from some bruises and soreness, I was fine. The truck, however, was in far worse shape than I was. Considering it took an entire day for the towing company to finally pull it back fully onto the road, the frame was damaged beyond repair. The only bright side of the entire harrowing event was that I somehow came out of it relatively unscathed. My guardian angel must have been watching over me that night. After a week of recovery time and paperwork, it was time for me to get back on the road. My boss arranged for me to take out one of our smaller box trucks for local deliveries around the Kingston area, while they searched for a replacement rig for me. I was grateful to have light duty close to home after my near-death experience in the mountains. On my first day back, I was feeling pretty good about getting behind the wheel again, as I headed out to make deliveries to some of our regular stops. That optimistic feeling rapidly faded once I merged onto the highway headed north. As traffic picked up speed around me, the traumatic memories of skidding on the slick mountain highway came flooding back. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and my palms began to sweat. My heart started racing as I pictured myself once again punching through the flimsy guardrail, teetering on the cliff's edge. I could vividly recall the sickening sound of screeching tires fighting helplessly for traction on the rain-soaked road. Suddenly, brake lights flashed on the car ahead of me as traffic slowed. In my panicked state, I slammed on the brakes, causing the truck to fishtail violently to the right across multiple lanes before straightening back out. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath and slow my racing pulse. I knew then that there was no way I could safely drive a fully loaded 18-wheeler if I was freaking out from a simple slowdown in this box truck. I had to get my nerves under control before getting assigned a new rig, or I'd likely crash again on my first haul. As soon as I completed my deliveries for the day, I decided to schedule an appointment to see a therapist and discuss the harrowing accident I'd endured. I met with Dr. Kaplan later that week and described the overwhelming anxiety I felt when driving since the incident. She helped me understand that my reactions were normal after such a traumatic experience. She suggested trying exposure therapy, where I would gradually face the situations that triggered anxiety, starting small and working my way up to longer drives. Dr. Kaplan also taught me some relaxation and mindfulness techniques to use when I felt a panic attack coming on. Over the next several weeks, I followed her advice and saw amazing improvements. I was able to work my way up to multi-hour highway trips and remain perfectly calm behind the wheel. When I got word from my company that my new rig was ready, I felt confident and excited to hit the road again instead of the overwhelming dread I'd initially felt. On my first haul in the new truck, I decided to take the same route toward Burlington to face my fears head-on. As I drove along twisting mountain passes in the pouring rain, memories of my prior crash attempted to creep in. But instead of giving in to panic, I focused on my breath, played relaxing music, and reminded myself that I was in control. The drive ended up being uneventful, which was exactly what I needed to rebuild my confidence that I could handle these roads. Dr. Kaplan was proud of the progress I'd made when I saw her for a follow-up. She cleared me to return to driving routes through the mountains full-time. I was thrilled to get back out on the open road and continue the job I loved. In the weeks that followed, I had a newfound focus and cautiousness when driving treacherous roads in inclement weather. I took my time, kept steadier speed, and pulled over instead of risking slick conditions. My company even asked me to lead a safety training based on techniques I'd learned in therapy. I was glad to share my experience if it helped prevent other drivers from meeting a similar fate. As much as my accident had shaken me, it taught me to respect the power of Mother Nature. I became a more attentive driver focused on safety, no longer just rushing to reach destinations as I did when I was younger. I realized just how precious life is, and that my mistakes could impact others too. While I hoped to never again endure a white-knuckle near-death experience, I was grateful for the lessons it imprinted on me. I had emerged wiser and more skilled at navigating the open road, and whatever unexpected twists and turns crossed my path. Story 3. Whenever I needed to pull a really early shipment from a warehouse, I preferred to just sleep in my truck in the parking lot rather than going home and driving to the warehouse to pick up the rig in the morning. But the peace you find can often turn into something haunting, as I learned that night. I realized it was probably best for my own peace of mind to stop looking out the truck windows after dark, after what I saw underneath the streetlights. I still can't quite explain it, but I'm almost positive that it was another person. But their actions were so strange. You see, it was the middle of June on the night after it had just rained, so the air was filled with a thick fog that made it nearly impossible to see anything. Even the lights in the parking lot only seemed to be able to brighten up the spot directly underneath them. As I sat in my truck getting settled in for the night, I pulled out my hot plate and got ready to make a small box of mac and cheese for myself. Normally, that was my favorite part of the night, but for some reason I couldn't shake this feeling that there was someone watching me. I kept looking out the windows and around the truck, but from what I could tell at first, there was nothing or no one there. I decided to cook and then eat my food. As the time continued to flow, and just as I was getting ready to step outside and rinse the pot that I cooked in out with a jug of water that I kept in the back, I saw it. Looking through the passenger side window, I could see what seemed to be a figure dressed all in white standing underneath the street light. It was hard to distinguish what it was that I was looking at from the fog that surrounded it, but as I continued to look, I could make out more and more details. After sitting in the passenger seat just watching them, it appeared as if they were staring directly back at me. Now, even though everything in my body was telling me to just stay in the truck, I'd also started to wonder if maybe it was just a warehouse worker who might need help with their car or something. Against my better judgment, I began rolling my window down a bit and called out from my truck. asking them if they needed any help. But there was no response. The figure just cocked its head to the side a bit and continued to stare in my direction. After a moment of silence passed, I was too uncomfortable to leave the window open anymore, so I closed it and then made sure that all the doors were locked and secured. I turned to look over to the driver's side to make sure that door was locked all the way. And by the time I looked back to the streetlight, the figure was gone. For a second I felt a bit of relief, but then that overwhelming feeling of something watching me was back. I frantically looked around the fog, hoping to catch a glimpse of where that person went. It took me a moment, but eventually I found them. I practically jumped out of my seat and into the back of my cab out of fear as I noticed that they were now walking toward my truck with their heads still cocked to the side. Even though I was sure that I was looking at a person, I couldn't help but get the sense that there was something much darker involved here, even though I know that's ridiculous. I locked eyes with the figure as it got closer and closer to my door. To my surprise, it eventually passed right by me, but to my horror, I realized that it was only to circle around the truck. The figure disappeared behind the truck's blind spot, and that was when I heard a sound that made my skin crawl, as if they were dragging metal across metal. There was this intense screeching noise that came from the trailer that was hooked up to the back of the truck. I tried to find the source of the noise, but by the time it stopped, I couldn't see anything or anyone. I sat in my truck for another few minutes in fear, looking over my shoulder every other second, wondering where that person had gone. Thankfully, they never came back, but when I woke up the next morning and stepped outside the cab to do my inspection, I realized that there was a massive scratch running along the back end of the trailer. I looked around for any sign of the person that I had seen the previous night, but I couldn't find anything. And when I spoke to the warehouse manager about the incident, she mentioned that a similar instance had occurred to another driver about 2 years before me, but no one could ever find out who it was that was standing in the parking lot. All I know is that was the last time I decided to sleep in the cab instead of in my bed when I had the option, even if it means waking up and driving to the truck really early in the day. In the weeks following that bizarre and unsettling encounter, I tried to convince myself that it was just some drunk messing around. But deep down I knew there was something more sinister at play. The image of that pale figure gliding through the fog toward my truck was seared into my mind. I found myself avoiding that warehouse parking lot whenever possible, taking loads from our other depots instead. Of course, the dispatchers started to notice the pattern and weren't too thrilled about it. One day, Marty called me into his office and point blank asked me why I was dodging that location. I considered making up an excuse, but finally decided just to tell him the truth. I described the eerie events of that night, from the mac and cheese dinner to the bone-chilling sounds of metal scraping metal. Marty's expression shifted from frustration to concern as I told the tale. He admitted no other drivers had reported anything odd, but he also knew I wasn't the type to make up ghost stories. In the end, he agreed I wouldn't have to haul out of there after dark anymore. For a few months, that arrangement worked well. I took the place off my availability for night runs and never had to think about that parking lot once the sun went down. But of course, it couldn't last forever. One Friday, Marty approached me apologetically, saying he had no choice but to assign me an overnight haul from that warehouse. There was a major shipment that had to get to the coast by Monday, and every other driver was booked up. He promised I could take a weekend off to make up for it. I wanted to argue but knew he was in a tough spot. Begrudgingly, I agreed to do the run, trying to ignore the feeling of dread settling in my gut. That night, I pulled into the familiar parking lot with the headlights blazing, half expecting to see a pale spectre lurking under the sodium lights. Part of me hoped that my imagination had simply gotten carried away that first night. But the prickling sense that I was being watched returned as soon as I stepped out of the cab. I decided to skip cooking dinner in favor of hurrying to grab my paperwork so I could hightail it out of there. As I scanned the rows of trailers looking for the one I was picking up, that's when I spotted it. Behind a pillar on the other side of the lot stood an impossibly tall, thin figure draped in pale fabric that seemed to flutter in a wind I couldn't feel. The overhead lights only illuminated it in flashes as it skulked behind objects. But there was no mistaking it was the same entity I had encountered months before. Fear lanced through me, mingled with frustration that I hadn't just refused this run. Moving cautiously, I edged toward my assigned trailer, keeping one eye on the creeping figure. Just as I reached to undo the door latch, an ear-piercing metallic shriek echoed through the lot. I jumped back, heart pounding against my ribs as I realized the sound was coming from directly above me. I craned my neck to see the source and felt my blood turn to ice. There, perched atop the trailer, sat the pale wraith, its thin arm dragging a long spike slowly across the metal roof, producing the horrendous screeching. It cocked its head down at me, but made no move to climb down as I stumbled back in terror. Without thinking, I sprinted for my cab, scrambling into the seat and locking the doors. I could still hear its vile scraping as I fumbled for my phone and called Marty, pleading with him to send another driver. But he angrily informed me there was no one else and I needed to deal with it. When I hung up, the screeching had ceased, but I could see the faint shape of the apparition still atop the trailer. After a sleepless night spent trying unsuccessfully to talk myself into getting out and driving away, I was startled by a tap on the cab window. It was Bill, another driver, casually asking if I was having some kind of breakdown. I tried to explain, but he just laughed it off and called me a baby. Fueled by anger and embarrassment, I finally worked up the nerve to exit the truck and hitch up to the trailer, getting the hell out of there before the thing returned. I finished the haul safely, but vowed it would be my last to that destination. If Marty wanted to fire me for refusing, so be it. Some jobs just aren't worth it.